the Shute podcast.
Obviously, I mean, you have a PhD, so it's very credible. I just want to make sure I point that out to people because I think there's obviously some perceptions about this topic. What about near-death experiences? I know you mentioned one person that kind of flips their beliefs on some of this stuff because they had a near-death experience. That's always a fascinating thing to go through, and it kind of goes into that global consciousness.
For perfectly reasonable reasons, a lot of people are skeptical about these things because they haven't had such an experience. For somebody who does have such an experience, they're no longer skeptical because only a crazy person would deny their own experience. Now, some people may not want to talk about it. In fact, a lot of people don't want to talk about their strange experiences for fear of being thought off the beam. But sometimes people will admit it. And oftentimes, for me at least, since I get a lot of these stories by email, that people will say, I've never told anyone this before. And they write back and say, oh, it's an interesting experience. Have you told people in your family? They didn't tell their wife, they didn't tell their husband, their children. Nobody knows that they had an experience, which is actually pretty common. And other people in their family probably have had it too. They just don't talk about it, which is a pity, really, because it only sustains the taboo that there's something weird about it. Well, it's not something weird. All of the evidence that we know is that the vast majority of people have the capacity to have these experiences. And many, many people have had at least one experience of this type.
But with the near-death experiences specifically, because some people say that's hallucinations from the brain.
Yeah.
What is your theory, based on the research that you've done on that? What is your theory is what's really going on there?
Well, so there's two schools of thought. Is it a result of lack of oxygen in the brain or some other mundane explanation, like DMT is released in the brain or something like that? I'm pretty well convinced from the people I know who have studied these things, it is not those explanations. It doesn't fit. Because if somebody not getting enough oxygen, memory of the event and their ability to be clear about what was happening very quickly degrades. And that's not what happens in these things. These are memories that persist at very high clarity for the rest of their life. So people have actually been interviewed after an NDE and then 20 years later, and it's the same story. It's like there's no confabulation happening or memory distortion. It was such a dramatic event that they remember it very clearly. Is it hallucination, distortions, all that? In some cases, it might be. But I think overall, there are enough cases where the experience of separating from the body is something that is as close to what we think happened as they can report. So this is like the mainstream view within how to interpret near-death experience. When somebody has a near-death experience and they start reporting about going into the tunnel and seeing departed loved ones and having all kinds of experiences, there's no way to check that. So it becomes an interesting story, but unless we can confirm it, it remains a story. I mean, it's clearly a story that changed their life, but it's not going to convince anybody else. The one area of near-death experience that is thought to be objectively verifiable is when somebody goes out of body, say in an operatory or after an accident, and they are floating above the scene and they look down and they can see things which they later report, which turns out to be true, like how they were resuscitated, what people were wearing, all kinds of things. There's a different interpretation of what's going on there. It's possible that they are really separated somehow and their awareness is elsewhere. It's also possible, though, even though their EEG might be flatlined, so it looks like the brain is totally dead. It's not working at all. And kind of bypassing the idea that we know that the brain actually takes a while to settle down to really go flatline. So when an EEG is picking up is surface level, but there's all kinds of activity going on for quite a while. So let's ignore that and assume that when your cortex goes flatline, you're gone, even though that may not be true. So if it is gone, and people said, oh, I was flatlined, and yet I saw these things happening during the surgery. How is that possible? Well, one thing we know about psychic phenomena is that anything that pulls you out of your ordinary state of awareness, psi abilities go up. This is why you get much more psychic things happening in the dream state and after drumming and dancing and psychedelics and whatever. It's your ordinary state of awareness is kind of locking you in here. And all these other states allows you to expand. Think about a state of awareness that is more dramatic than in the process of dying or the process of being resuscitated. So in the process of dying, the psychic ability, which perceived through space and time, might well jump out of what amounts to our current timeline and see something interesting happening in their future, like a surgeon doing something that they didn't expect. Well, then they're dead, and nothing's happening when they're dead. And later they're resuscitated, and they remember what they got before they were dead. The question I'm talking about here is, when did the report happen? And my sense is that when somebody has a near-death experience, the experience they're having is when they're in the process of dying or the process of being resuscitated. It is not happening during the time when they're considered to be clinically dead. So I don't know that that's the case. I'm just saying that as a plausibility argument, we actually don't have any way of knowing that an experience that happened when somebody was flatlined was actually when they were flatlined. There's no way to report that because they can't respond when they're dead. This is a minority opinion among people who study near-death experience because they would rather believe that we actually can persist without the body. I would like to believe that too, except when I start thinking about the way that I know that we see psychic things happening in the laboratory, we know that it's not tightly bound in space or time. We know that it gets a lot better when you're pulled away from ordinary states of awareness. So a near-death experience from that context begins to look more like it's not that you're really separated from your body. It's more that you become suddenly really psychic and can see things that haven't happened yet, like vanilla precognition.
Okay, that's an interesting take on that.